All right, well, we'll go ahead and get started. I want to welcome everyone to the Shepherd Higher Education Consortium on Poverty's first Springboard event. My name is Tim Dieppe. I'm Executive Director of SHECP, and I want to thank the Programs Committee for leading the organization of today's event on language and poverty. So today we've got hopefully 3 people with us. I know timing is always challenging. So far we have with us Netta Avineri, Associate Professor at the Middlebury Institute of International Studies. We have Lynn, Cockett, Professor of Communications at Juniata. She'll also serve as the moderator. And then hopefully joining us will be Colón, Professor of Media Ethics at WNL. So thank you to all those who are joining, and I can see you now as attendees, and to those watching the recording. So I'm going to turn things over and get out of the way to our moderator for the session, as I mentioned, Lynn Cockett. And I'll start actually with a question to you, Lynn, and then let you take over. So why in your work is it important to study language in the context of persons experiencing poverty? And could you provide an example? So thank you.
All right, thank you. I'm really glad to meet you all, and I'm really happy to be here with you today. And Tim asks a really important question, and that's why is it important to study language in this particular context? And as a person who is sort of trained as a sociolinguist and a communication scholar in a communication department, I pay lots of attention to language, not only in how it's used in the media and sort of in the larger discursive universe of different kind of identity categories, but I'm also really interested in how we use language in everyday talk and different people's ideologies of how language works and what they think about language. And so I'm very interested in extrapolating from what people say, what they actually believe about language. And so one of the things that I think is really important here is understanding how everyday people use language around things like poverty and food insecurity and unhoused or people experiencing homelessness, right? And in using language like that, we very clearly tell others without explicitly telling them what we believe about people who live experiencing conditions related to poverty. And so for me, I'm especially interested in the way that those things come up in interaction between people. And so very briefly, today, just this morning, I was teaching a qualitative methods class where we're learning about interviewing. And today the topic was food insecurity among college students. And so it just happened that this happened today. And in that class, we spent quite a bit of time talking about how people conflate houselessness or food insecurity with poverty, and the two things are not the same. And so we spent lots of time thinking about that and what are the implications of conflating those two things. And so that's sort of where I come from. And Netta, I would like to ask you to give your sort of little introduction. Your research has critiqued the language gap as an explanation of poverty. And so I think that may be related to what my students were talking about today. So can you tell us a little bit about the language gap and what you've learned from studying it?
Sure. Thanks, Lynn, and thanks everyone for organizing. I'm happy to be here with everyone. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to share my screen for just a couple slides that will respond to your question, Lynn, and give a little bit of broader framing around my own thinking around language and poverty, a view from applied linguistic anthropology. So my training is in both applied linguistics and linguistic anthropology. So I'm very much interested in interdisciplinary approaches to complex problem solving and how to bring in different perspectives, different voices, different communities to make sense of what's happening in the broader world. And so in terms of how we bring together applied linguistics and linguistic anthropology, what my colleagues and I have been working on for a number of years is a sort of a 4-step process. The first is that we identify an issue or a topic that's relevant in relation to social change or a social justice issue, and we center language as it relates to that topic. So if we're talking about food insecurity or poverty or sports team mascot names or immigration, we're looking at any topic and really trying to think really deeply about how language is central to that social issue. What we've done with our students is and ourselves in our own advocacy work was to really do a deep dive into what has been, look at the histories that have created the structural inequities that are present today, to really use anthropological methods like participant observation, interviewing, ethnographic methodologies to make, and also thinking about our own positionalities and commitments in relation to that issue, to really think through what do we see now, what can we see in the media, what can we experience and notice ourselves, and then through that process envision what could be. I think for a lot of our students, they're very, very interested in what could be. They're trying to figure out what the future can look like. And so we have all of these methods for making sense of what has been, what is. And so we envision this new world. So in that way, we're looking at how language is both implicated in issues of justice and also how language can be mobilized for justice. And I was thinking this morning about what that means, and Lynn, what I was also hearing you say is about how we talk about people and issues, how we talk with people, and the languages we talk in. So, in terms of language access and what languages our surveys and interviews are in, for example. And my close colleague, Jonathan Rosa, talks a lot about how language change is important and it's central to this work, and it's insufficient on its own. So we have to kind of marry the structural change with the language change, and his work in particular with looking at how we refer to immigrants and migrant populations in the media and how that impacts or doesn't policy change around immigration. So just a couple of other framing comments before I respond to your direct question, Lynn, if that's okay, is that the way that I usually work with my students that are doing critical service learning or community engagement research is to think about engaging in a with relationship with communities as opposed to a for relationship with communities. So that kind of framing about accompaniment versus empowerment. And my own background is in Jewish studies service learning. And so we talk a lot about chesed versus tikkun olam. So charity versus kind of structural change, and thinking about how if there's someone experiencing housing insecurity who at that moment is asking you for money because they need something right then, versus looking at structural change and working with social organizations to make change, that we have to be thinking about change at both of those scales. And so how our students engage with individuals in that regard. So as I mentioned, there are some examples that we've worked with that are broader than the issues of poverty that I know we're addressing today, but it can give you a sense about mascot names, census categories, et cetera. So specifically in relation to language and poverty, and I know, Lynn, you've already mentioned a few of these examples, which is great to see how these coalesce, but how we talk about people. And I know, for a long period of time, we would just say homeless person, or that, this is a person, we wouldn't say this person is experiencing homelessness. So already that kind of people first language to really highlight dignity is central to the work that a lot of us are doing. But I think also, being more specific, I know that some of the work we've done here in the Monterey area has been specifically around women who sleep in their cars. And so that is a particular issue. And so being explicit about that calls attention to the issue, and also, recognizes some of these issues around how we think about deficit versus asset, but also how do we coalesce with the audiences with whom we're trying to engage in social change work. So the talk with is interviews, story sharing, and how that connects with policy change and advocacy. And then the languages that we use, so language access, translations, interpretation, multilingual service providers. So really when it comes down to it, I know that a lot of the work that we all do has to do with cultivating knowledge, skills, and dispositions for our students to engage with community members in these various areas. So in particular, the language gap is this notion that was from Hart and Risley in 1995. It was this idea that young children from marginalized backgrounds have a 30 million word language gap in relation to middle class peers, and that my colleagues and I talk about this anthropolitical approach to thinking about the language gap, where it's a kind of a blame the victim, deficit focused discourse that doesn't look at structural inequities of race, class, education and poverty. And so we really are looking, we've seen, I have colleagues who've done like methodological revisions of the language gap research that really recognize that all that children are doing in their homes that isn't necessarily English, and that isn't necessarily measured in the ways that were in the original study. And in addition to that, we have done critical discourse analysis of media sources that talk about the language gap. So we're doing this kind of in a multifaceted way to really recognize that we can't say that just because you know more language, that means that you'll be lifted out of poverty, right? We're trying to really think about it at a more structural level. So I'll stop there. So hopefully that just gives some framing comments.
Thank you so much. Yes, you've given me so many things to talk about. And the hard part about being a facilitator is that you're supposed to do less talking. So if other people who are here as participants and observers, if you have questions, please just throw them in the chat and I'll go through them after we're done with Allie. And so Allie, my first question for you, which I think is a good segue from how Netta just ended her talk, is that you have more than 30 years of experience in journalism, including as Director of Standards and Practices at NBC News and Telemundo Network News. When you were involved in stories covering persons experiencing poverty, lack of financial or other resources, can you give a couple examples of the sort of issues or conversations that you would have as a part of the process of preparing a story on how you would preserve the dignity of people in situations like this? That's a long question, so I can repeat parts of it if you want.
So you're absolutely right. Having been a journalist for many years, I've encountered, covered, and edited stories, regarding the poor, the poverty, and the situation that really brings us to when we have people going to do that kind of coverage who may not have experienced it. And that's sort of important for all of us to remember that haven't had that experience, that we go in a way, I like to think of us as visitors, as guests in a world that we sometimes as journalists go in there without being asked. In fact, in too many places, I think we go in there without being asked, and not everybody always happy when we come there, and some are. But in this kind of situation, it really requires, from my perspective, a tremendous sense of humility and a definite suspension of judgment, because that's comes too easily, I think, to any of us as human beings. But in particular, it can come to journalists as well, because there is the view somehow that because we are covering something or reporting on something, that we become somewhat of an expert on it. And certainly we in the position we use as sort of the person who is becoming the substitute for the rest of society who is not going to these places, we become more alert to what's going on, I would like to think. But it also means we have to be far more careful about not being arrogant about the fact that what we see, we understand. And that's just a critical element to the journalism that I believe in and practice, and why I was, for periods of time, dealing with issues of, and still do, dealing with ethics and standards and practices, because I was in positions where, a journalist, I would describe something pretty horrible, and a journalist, unfortunately, might think, this is great, this is a great story. And it's a natural reaction because this is what you are prepared for in the world, but it's not the reaction you should have as a human being. And that can get, it's not just like, unlike, frankly, being an academic, you get excited about books that are really horrible because you're excited about what they teach. But when you get too far into that kind of enjoyment, then there's something wrong about how you may present it. So I will try to keep this really short, but one of the things that, I thought about with regards to journalists and how they deal with things, and an example of that is that I got some video that I was asked, that I usually had to review those certain things that had some uncertainty about it, where a man was sitting on a curb. He had nobody there but his friends. He was not well dressed, and he looked like he might have been, in a good position to have something to eat, but hadn't. So he's sitting on a curb on a street, and people were sort of coming around him, right? And they didn't know what to do. And some people were wanted to help him, but he had a dog there, and this dog was sort of like guarding him. It wasn't biting anybody, but it was certainly snarling if anybody came close to the man who was sitting on the curb, who I assumed was its owner. And so here was the man. There were people around him trying to do something to help the man, not thinking really, I think, about the dog, but not getting close to the dog. So they call the police. And of course, they call, the press. And we always like, come on, cover things where people are doing things they shouldn't be doing anyway. So there they are. And the policeman comes, and he doesn't know what to do. And the dog, to protect its owner, which I assumed is what it was, leaps forward toward the policeman, and the policeman pulls out a gun and shoots him. Okay? So that's where they want the video that they want to show. And they said, can we do that? And I said, no, you can't do that. I usually don't say no, but this time I want to make sure they understood. I usually go through the explanation. Well, would you like the people who were having dinner at 5 o'clock see this particular segment of video where a dog is being shot? And one of them said, well, yeah, it'd be exciting. They'll pay my, I said, no, you're not going in the right direction here. Let me explain to you about the humanity of the story that we're witnessing and we're dealing with. And so they said, well, can we just show the guy shooting the dog? And I said, well, how would that look to people who are watching this, seeing a policeman shoot a dog? They're still not seeing on the man who's on the curb. And how would you address that and help them understand the situation of what's going on here? And they said, okay, well, how about if we shoot the dog, but we don't show what happens to the dog, and if we just muffle the sound? And you can tell they're very, very diligent in trying to get as much video as they can. And finally, what we came to an agreement with, much with my encouragement, was you can have the policeman there, and he can pull his gun out, but you have to stop it there. And that's where he goes. And then you explain through narrative, the policeman pulled his gun. This is what happened. This is what happened to the man on the curb. All right. So they said, okay. But what they didn't know until a few minutes later was the dog survived. He flipped around, got back up, and went back to its owner, who welcomed him back in his arms. So, what's the point of a story like this for me is that we are dealing with obviously someone who's not part of what we would expect the people of society that can take care of themselves. He's on a curb. Nobody knows what to do with him. He's got his dog who protects him. He's got a policeman who's come out and just shot his dog, but the dog survives and goes back to its owner. And then as a result of that, the follow of the story was they got someone from social services to come and help the man and help with the dog, right? So the story I tell there is because this is full of stereotypes that are there for people to witness and to believe in. The poor guy shouldn't have a dog. What's he doing on the curb? Why isn't somebody taking him off? What's a policeman doing? Why are you calling a policeman, when you could call a social worker to come and help out there? So there's all these sort of questions about what's taking place. And we have to be more cognizant, not of playing a role as journalists, but of trying to understand what the roles in plural are and how we can bring the reality to the degree we can that is taking place so that the viewer, the reader, whoever it might be, has a better understanding of the dynamics and the humanity at this particular situation. So this is what I think can often be the case with journalists, and I try to remind them to this, is that, and it's for anyone to some degree with the professional expertise in this field, is how do you focus on applying your humanity to the work of understanding people who may lack material goods, but may offer opportunities of the spirit? We can easily think of people who are poor as not having anything, but they may have so much more than we can ever imagine, and frankly, that we can learn from, but we do it based sometimes on our first look and our assumptions. So the difficulty for journalists, I say, has less to do with the content they seek in their coverage. It has more to do with the internal gauge of human worth that cannot be counted in coins and bills and paper. The character a person displays manifests itself in how the person handles the struggles associated with the life they have been given or they become a part of, So the challenge as well is, how do you as a journalist capture the person's character? Not necessarily what's around the person itself, because you'll find out more about that later. And it's being open, not just to what you see, but what you don't see. What are the things that are missing from this picture, if you were a journalist, that you should not assume you can fill in by yourself without becoming more knowledgeable and more understanding of the environment you happen to be in, and for which you may or may not have an appreciation for the knowledge that it requires to work with and to come alongside people who are in a different phase of life that you might be. And, fortunately, one paper I worked on, they had an individual who covered people in very difficult communities, and he did very well. And he did very well because he had been one of them. And he knew what it was like to be on the outside with people looking in, thinking they knew better. So I'll just leave it there for now, but that's sort of where I believe, when we talk about the journalism, I'm always thinking of what's the middle of the word journalism. It's the word our. And it's our story, our coverage, and it's our outreach to understand the world around us so we can tell that story for others.
Thank you so much, Ali. We have a question from our attendees, and I think actually it's a fantastic question that bridges a lot of what both of you are talking about in your comments. I heard a lot about thematically, I heard about the way that we symbolize with and about people experiencing poverty. So whether those symbols are visual symbols or linguistic symbols, they're all forms of communication. And in all of those situations, we are always communicating what we believe, right? And I think you both are kind of talking about those things. So Dr. Tarita Poole, who's one of my colleagues here at Juniata, asks, how do each of you decenter your own identities and phenomenological experiences in trying to contextualize and understand how language shapes the reality of others or the ways in which we come to think about poverty? And I'm glad that you guys get to answer that one and not me. So I'll throw it open to anyone who wants to take that one of our panelists.
I'm happy to go if that's okay. So yeah, I mean, I love the question. And I was actually, when I was reading it, I was like, do I focus first on the center or the decenter? Because it's such a great question. I mean, I know something that I try to do for myself first, and then also what I try to model for our students, is that a huge part of this work is, I think, recognizing both our identities, that the whole range of intersectionalities in relation to who we are when we're engaging in this work, and then going that step further to think about our positionalities in a given context. So especially with students, and I know for myself, if I'm working with a community organization that is focused on housing insecurity, and I myself have not experienced that, but I'm very passionate about this issue. Part of an activity that I have students do is a really deep dive into your positionalities in relation to a given context and issue, and then also what are your commitments that are associated with that. And sometimes what happens is that there's a complete match, right? Like I've experienced housing insecurity, and that's part of who I am. I am a woman, and that's why I want to do this work. And therefore I'm working with women experiencing housing insecurity. Like there's a match there immediately. And in many cases, like what I was hearing Ali talk about, was that in many cases, you're not part of that group. And so how do you do that work alongside and that accompaniment, even though you are recognizing your own positionality. So I think for me personally, when I've done any kind of community engaged research or critical service learning engagement or working with students, or even for my own advocacy work myself, is I do think that it's important to do those reflections, to consider who we are in relation to these issues, and then to really think deeply about the roles and relationships and the ethics that we're trying to engage with once we're working with a community or a group of people that we view as different from ourselves. So I think identifying those similarities and connection points, and especially those positionalities and those commitments and how those are intertwined. So that's usually how I approach it.
Thank you. We do have another question, and we do have about 3.5 minutes left. So I'm going to throw it out there and see if we can cover that one quickly. This one is from Shauna Shapiro, who asks, how can we call in versus call out a person who's using deficit or dehumanizing discourse, language, imagery, despite that honors their good intentions, but also does good work of making the change that we're talking about here?
Sure, and I know Ali has many things to say about this, so I'll be quick. And thanks, Shauna, for the question. It's good to see you, hear you here. So I think, yeah, the calling in and calling out, this idea of naming what's problematic about what somebody has said, but also doing it in such a way where you're kind of building that dialogic space of thinking through, why did you say that? Why do I say what I say? And really having that kind of open up and think it through. I mean, I think something that I've been doing recently is an activity, and I do this a lot for myself, it's called pay attention to the tension to set intention. And so if there is a moment where somebody has said something where it kind of was like, that's not really the right word, or that isn't really how people are describing this issue now, and I have that reaction, and to kind of pause and think about why it bothers me, or why I feel like it's not really the right way to say something, and then to really have this kind of curious openness to asking why do you use that term? I'm curious. I know, kind of that open dialogue. And I know it's not always possible, because if somebody's really using something that's either a racist term or something that's really discriminatory, it's maybe more difficult in some cases, also depending on our own positionalities in relation to that term, to really engage in that dialogue. But that's usually what I've been doing. Like, I had an example of a student, and it wasn't my class, but it was a curriculum that I had helped develop. And I was observing the class, and a student used a term, I won't use it here, but he used a term to refer to people experiencing homelessness. And the student themselves was an ESL student. So they were learning about housing insecurity and learning language while they were here in the US. And I encouraged the educator in that case to talk with the student and sort of explain or try to make sense of, why are you using that term? Where have you heard that before? And to really engage in that sort of dialogic experience together. And I think that creates that call in environment where it's more about, let's think this through together, and then coalesce around what we should be saying and why, so that it can become, in the social change, future oriented direction. So that's how I usually approach it. But Ali, I'm sure you have other things to say. So.
Well, I know how much time we have, so I don't want to overdo that. If we're ready to move on, it's okay with me, or I can say something quickly.
Ali, why don't you just jump in real quick, and then we'll wrap up.
All right. Well, the thing I like to say is I'm an Army brat. Well, I don't know why they call us brats, but the term is a child of military people who move around a lot. So I've moved around every year or two of my life. And what I realized early on is that I was a village ignoramus. I would come place where I thought I knew what was going on. I had no clue. And so I was sort of forced culturally to shut my mouth, to watch what's going on, and to lean on the knowledge of others to help me understand the particular place that I was in. And I think that's been a good guide for me in journalism, and a good guide for me in other situations where what I try to do is learn from those that are there, as opposed to coming in with the answers and supposed knowledge that I have from outside.
Great. Well, what a great thought-provoking conversation. Thank you all. I really wish we had more time, but we did want to structure this with the intention of hopefully conversations will continue, on your campuses, and I'll get to that in just a moment. But I just want to thank everyone who joined us live, our panelists, Trita and Shauna, for your questions, Lynn, and finally, each school's internship director and academic director do have questions that I sent, but I just want to read them really quickly. So for those who are maybe don't have access to those folks who watch the recording or watching this live and want to continue the conversation. So a couple of the suggested questions were, have you ever seen a shift in language result in a shift in attitudes or behaviors? How could small shifts in language promote dignity, increase understanding, and or help diminish poverty? Who should be driving changes around language? Researchers, practitioners, media, individuals impacted by poverty? Can you think of examples of when these groups were not in agreement? What impact did that have? SHECP describes its work as, quote, preparing students for a lifetime of professional and civic efforts to diminish poverty and enhance human capability, end quote. After hearing the panel discussion, what do you think are the advantages and disadvantages of that description? And finally, how is poverty represented in the language we use in our campus courses and programming? Is this consistent with the language you hear in the community or in the media? Of course, there's lots of other ways to get that conversation going, so I wouldn't want to crimp off the conversation with those, but hopefully you do continue those conversations. Thanks again to everyone joining, and hope you have a wonderful day. Thank you.